kept small and hidden, trees supposedly planted to hide it, and the entire region placed under guard and forbidden to enter. Even today, the area is called the Ich Horig, the Great Taboo, and only the most limited of non-intrusive scientific surveys have been undertaken in the area. There are, of course, other variations to the story, such as the caravan becoming stuck in the Ordos Desert. In the Ordos, during the Qing dynasty, a shrine was built to honor the Khan's spirit, the cause of some misconception today that he was literally buried there. Other rumors mentioning the killing of every individual the funeral cortege came across. Human sacrifice is not mentioned with Chinggis's immediate burial, but a few years later, his son Ogadai sent 40 maidens for his father's soul. Beyond that, we know almost nothing about the details. Inference, based off of what we know of the burials of later Khans, are hard to apply to Chinggis, as these later burials had influence from sedentary cultures, though many Mongol Khans and notables would be buried on Burkhan Khaldun in the following 2 centuries. So ends the life of Chinggis Khan, founder of the Mongol Empire, conqueror of much of Eurasia, and flail of God. His death was met by sorrow among his people, cheers from peoples across Asia, and bated breath by the empire's neighbors, waiting to see what would come next. Chinggis's third son, Ogadai, was to succeed his father, inheriting a powerful, experienced, and loyal army, staffed by generals and officers who believed it was their destiny to ride over everything under the eternal blue sky. Once a young boy abandoned by his tribe, Chinggis had, over time, forged his people into a weapon, by the end of his life approaching the status of a demigod among them. Today, Mongolians cherish him as the founder of their nation, and his reign was a turning point in Eurasian history. Kingdoms across the world were washed away by his armies, and an unprecedented era of Eurasian integration was to be ushered in by his successors. Could Ogadai live up to Chinggis's legacy, or would he be lost in the shadow of a man which could blot out the sun? The continued expansion of the Mongol Empire is the topic of our next episodes, so be sure to subscribe to the Kings and Generals podcast, Ages of Conquest. And to continue helping us bring you more outstanding content, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. If you're unable to help financially but still want to support us, it would be highly appreciated if you can leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts to help us grow and bring you more Mongols. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one. The crowd that had assembled was mighty. The princes, sons, and generals from across the Mongol Empire had collected on the Harowin River in September 1229 to elect Ogadai, third son of Chinggis Khan, as Khan of Khans. From the line of Ogadai's late brother Jochi, his sons Orda, Batu, Berka, and more made the journey from the Kipchak steppe. Ogadai's 2 surviving full brothers and their children, Chagadai and Tolui, stood present, as were the only living siblings of Chinggis Khan, his brother Temugay, and half-brother Belgutai. It was a huge gathering, perhaps the final meeting of many members of the Old Guard, the last of those who had fought alongside Temujin to unify the Mongols, now watched as the reins of power were handed to the next generation. I'm your host David, and this is the Ages of Conquest podcast, The Mongol Invasions. Chinggis Khan had died in August 1227. 2 years had been needed for the appropriate funeral arrangements, for the various princes to return to Mongolia, and preparations for the coronation. Tolui had been appointed regent of the empire during those 2 years, and despite some later rumors, there can have been little doubt as to the decision. Chinggis Khan himself had decreed Ogadai to succeed him, and there could be no serious thought of challenging his will. To quote the Persian writer Giovanni, writing in the 1250s, Chinggis Khan spoke thus: If it is your wish to pass your lives in ease and luxury and to enjoy the fruits of sovereignty and wealth, my advice, as I have lately given you to understand, is that Ogadai should ascend the throne of the Khanate in my place because he stands out amongst you for the excellency of his firm counsel and the superiority of his perspicacious understanding, and that the government of the army and the people and the defense of the frontiers of the empire should be executed by his auspicious advice and good counsel. I therefore make him my heir and place the keys of the empire in the hands of his valor and ability. To which his sons are said to have replied, after kneeling before him, "Who hath the power to oppose the words of Chinggis Khan, and who the ability to reject it?" Removing their hats and belts as signs of submission, Chagadai took Ogadai's right hand, Temoge his left, and hoisted him on the throne, while Tului passed a cup to Ogadai, symbolically showing the three main alternatives supporting him. Then, all in attendance kneeled 3 times before Ogadai, saying, "May the kingdom prosper by his being Khan," then exited the grand tent, knelt to the sun 3 times, and returned into the tent to drink and cheer. Ogadai was now ruler of the Mongol Empire, taking not his father's title of Khan, but the older Turkic title Kahan, Khan of Khans, often transliterated as Khan, written with 2 A's. So, who was Ogadai? Born in 1186, the third son of Chinggis Khan and Borte, Ogadai was 43 years old when he became Khan. Not as skilled a military commander as his brothers, Ogadai instead had a reputation as generous, easygoing, and incredibly fond of alcohol. Unlike his surviving brothers, who could be unyielding like iron, Ogadai was one to compromise and seek solutions, and therefore stabilize the empire his father had created. It was Ogadai who famously constructed the imperial capital of Karakorum in Mongolia's Orkhan Valley. Early on in his reign, Ogadai took to administration with vigor, not just streamlining, but in many respects, creating an actual bureaucracy and tax system for the empire. Compared to Chagadai, Ogadai was rather positively portrayed by Muslim historians of the period, who shared numerous anecdotes, although many of questionable veracity, of Ogadai's intervening to save the lives of Muslims about to be executed for transgressing a law of Chinggis Khan, such as washing in a river. Of course, this is not to say Ogadai was a man of peace. As we will see in the coming episodes, the conquests continued rapidly on his orders, crushing the Jurchen Jin and remnants of Harzem, as well as driving into Europe in the 1240s. Ogadai could also fly into horrific rages and order slaughter and sacrifice, from sending 40 virgins to join Chinggis Khan in the next world, to a terrible rape of the women of the Oirat tribe, to continued destruction in China. Ogadai could order the deaths of thousands just as easily as his father. Later in his reign, Ogadai found increasing solace in alcohol and withdrew from government, leading to his sudden demise in December 1241. But in 1229, Ogadai was an energetic and ambitious monarch, one eager to prove himself a worthy successor to his father's enormous legacy. Ogadai needed to not just consolidate an empire, but set out finding long-term methods to rule one as well, rather than the temporary garrison occupation it had been to that point. Civilian administration had been completely subordinate to military rule. The general in the theater who held the highest office, such as Mukhali in North China from 1218 to 1223, had also acted as governor-general. Being engaged in ongoing conquest at the same time meant that civil matters were secondary, and the population was subject to the whims of whatever local power had survived the Mongol onslaught or been appointed to govern them. This often ended up an appointed general concerned with how best to mobilize their resources for the Mongol war effort or to enrich himself further. Furthermore, Chinggis Khan had never established a system of regular taxation. Taxes were collected in kind, that is, in whatever goods the Mongols felt they needed for the war effort, be they animals, weapons, iron, implements to be turned into weapons and foodstuffs. There was no regular interval for this, nor a set level of assessment. Mongol parties came and took what they needed, when they needed it, and the local populations were thus exploited, suffering depredations well beyond their initial subjugation. Upon taking the throne, Ogedai had several issues to deal with, such as the matter of how to accommodate the large, sedentary populations of North China and Transoxiana while completing the conquest of the Jin dynasty and Khwarezmian Empire. The Jin were now based behind the great defensive line of the Yellow River, with new generals leading a valiant defensive effort, while in western Iran, the son of Khwarezm Shah Muhammad II, Jalal al-Din Minburnu, had reappeared after years in India, making claim to restore his father's empire. Challenged from these fronts, on his ascension to Khan in late 1229, Ogedai held a council to decide the courses of action to take. Some choices were obvious. New military forces needed to be raised to crush these opponents. Chormahun Noyan, a member of the Keshig, the imperial bodyguard, was given a large force to destroy Jalal al-Din and subdue Iran. We will look at his campaign later in this series. In China, the Jin dynasty, though reduced, was not yet broken and had even reclaimed some territory in the years during the Han's absence. A final Mongol invasion of the Jin would be forthwith, though difficult, as their remaining territory was well fortified by the Yellow River, guarding the north, and the great fort of Tongguan, protecting the western approaches. The Chinese Song dynasty bordered the Jin to the south, and while no friend to the Jin, they remained neutral in the war. Careful planning was needed, and we will explore Mongol strategy in the final war against the Jin in our next episode. The other question raised at this council was what to do with the sedentary populations, especially in occupied North China. For some Mongols, the solution was simple. An extreme faction led by a general Bedgar suggested the total annihilation of the northern Chinese, turning the now empty land into pasture for their horses. For some at the meeting, this was beyond the pale. One such was the scholar Yellow Chusai. Chusai, you will remember, was a Khitan, a semi-nomadic people related to the Mongols who had once ruled China before the establishment of the Jurchen Jin Empire. Though adopting aspects of Chinese culture in the following centuries, they retained their identity, and many had risen up against the Jin with Chinggis Khan's invasion. Yellow Chusai entered the Khan's service in 1218. Having lived through the terrible siege of Zhongdu, he spent 3 years learning Buddhism before being called into Mongol service. His height, well over 6 feet, deep voice, and long beard down to his waist, instantly caught the attention of the Mongols, as did his proclamations of loyalty, a trait Chinggis Khan always valued. Yellow Chusai accompanied Chinggis Khan west into Khwarezm, where he served as a court astrologer, scribe, and advisor, building a network of contacts and a respected reputation among the Mongols, as well as a keen understanding of how the Chinggisids viewed the world. A great humanitarian, Yellow Chusai would not allow Ogedai to approve this genocide, and vehemently argued against it. His suggestion was to instead begin a system of regular taxation. Chusai knew that appealing to the Mongols' sense of empathy would be fruitless, so essentially argued this simple tenet: kill everyone and you'll only gain their wealth once, but tax them every year, and long-term, you'll make more revenue at less danger to yourself. Ogedai was intrigued and allowed Yellow Chusai to try out his strategy as part of the newly created Branch Secretariat for China. At the same time, a similar branch secretariat was established for the Islamic lands the Mongols controlled, headed by Muhammad Yalavach, a Turkic merchant who had been part of the embassy to Muhammad Khwarezm Shah in 1218. Yalavach likewise instituted tax reforms and rebuilding, and Ogedai was immediately pleased by the results. What Yalavach and Chusai did in both secretariats was basically set up systems of regular, categorized taxations though each with regional differences based on local tradition. In his secretariat, Yalovach's taxes were on every adult male, as per Islamic tradition, while in time Chusai's would align with the Chinese model of taxation based on the household, with different rates for urban and rural peoples. Streamlining taxation and reducing the numbers of minor officials and princes collecting taxes at whim meant that the revenues coming to the Mongol court increased significantly. Ogadai allowed Chusai further power for more reforms, and by 1231, Yellow Chusai was responsible for the administration of North China. Former officials of the Jin dynasty were rescued to aid Chusai's burgeoning bureaucracy. Rebuilding efforts were launched, the power of monasteries were curtailed, and fiscal obligations forced onto monks conducting business. Chusai had further ambitions, such as continued refinement of his tax system, and hoping to reduce the power of regional princes to strengthen the central government. Long term, his intention was a return to his idealized Confucian style of Chinese governance. You could almost say he looked to rescue the Chinese from Mongol rapaciousness, allowing northern China a chance to heal from the ravages of the Mongol-Jin wars. Chusai even managed to convince Ogadai to allow a census to be undertaken, something Chusai later came to regret, as we will discuss in future. Much of Ogadai's early reign was caught up with continued war with the Jin dynasty, subject of our next episode, but completed by 1234. Mongol victory there had been a long time coming, but Ogadai needed to continue his father's work should he wish to step out from under his shadow. In 1235, preparations began to be made for the Great Western Invasion. As you may recall, during the expedition of Zhev and Subadai, they had fought Rus, Kuman Kipchak, and Volga Bulgars, all peoples who now needed to be brought under Mongol rule. By this time, the Mongols were increasingly supporting the belief in their united destiny to rule the world. Those who rebuffed initial Mongol demands for submission, or worse, fought and even defeated Mongol armies, were an affront to the obvious will of heaven. The Song dynasty had made an unfortunate effort to claim, by force, the territory of the fallen Jin dynasty, and now the south of China too fell prey to Mongol designs. The scope of Ogadai's empire was increasing dramatically year by year. Don't worry though, we'll cover these regionally rather than overburden a single episode. Ogadai made adjustments to suit this expansion. One such was the expansion of the Yam system, essentially a relay system to quickly transport messages across the empire. It was similar to the American Pony Express, except the Mongol system actually lasted longer than 18 months. During Chinggis's reign, the Yam was confined to Mongolia, but Ogadai oversaw its extension into North China, the former Karakitai and occupied Khwarezmian territories, tying these far-flung corners to the central administration. The Yam was made up of relay stations, which a messenger could reach on a day's ride, quickly acquiring a new horse and provisions, and continuing onwards to the next station. As Ogadai, much like his father, was concerned with encouraging trade, he allowed merchants to utilize the system. To determine who could use what at each station, travelers were assigned with a garag, also known as a paisa, essentially a passport. The material the passport was made of, wood, iron, silver, or gold, determined what provisions the carrier could access at each station, and allowed them unimpeded or protected movements across this empire. Not that this system was without any issues, as it was the responsibility of local communities to provide provisions and animals for their nearest Yam station, leaving them exposed to exploitation of merchants or commanders lining their own pockets. To further facilitate these trade routes, Ogadai also ordered the construction of protected wells, security patrols, improved roads and bridges, all in order to encourage merchants to make the trip into Mongolia. But Ogadai knew that merchants would need a definite location to carry their wares to, as well as a place for diplomatic envoys to always find the Khan's representative. The extensive march of Qiu Chuji from northern China to Afghanistan to find Chinggis Khan was too inefficient to repeat. Partly for this purpose, in 1235, Ogadai ordered the construction of his most famous project, Karakorum, an actual capital city for the Mongol Empire. Once again, this may have been Ogadai expanding upon another of his father's ideas, though the specifics are somewhat murky. Chinggis Khan seems to have had a semi-permanent but poorly understood base at Avarga along the Harlan River in northeastern Mongolia, where he spent so much of his life. Archaeologically, little remains of Avarga, perhaps being little more than a location to store loot and house envoys or hostages from the sedentary world. 2 large mounds have been discovered there, and it has been speculated that each mound held a palace, one built for Chinggis and the other by Ogadai, though they were likely unimpressive structures surrounded by Mongolian gurs rather than walls. More interestingly is that for decades, the site continued to serve as a cultural and religious destination, and thousands of burned animal bones have been found there, indicating large and ongoing sacrifices. Perhaps rather than palaces, it has been speculated that the mounds were temples, and as the site had been associated with Chinggis, it became a holy memorial to him. Chinggis Khan may have not been totally averse to the notion of a capital then, though he may have seen them more as a useful place to store treasures too inconvenient to carry with him. But there is some evidence he actually chose the site of Karakorum and wanted to build a capital there. Late Yuan dynasty transcriptions and the Yuan Shi, History of the Yuan Dynasty, from 1370, assert Chinggis founded Karakorum in 1220. This is unlikely, as we know Chinggis spent all of 1220 campaigning in the Khwarezmian Empire. He did, however, pass through the Orkhon Valley, where Karakorum would later be built, on his way to invade Khwarezm in 1219. Entering the valley, Chinggis would have noted much to find attractive. Rich in water and grass, vital to maintaining the Mongols' valuable herd animals, its central location in Mongolia also placed it in easier reach of merchants and envoys, while still a safe distance from any sedentary foe. Further, it was a region of cultural and imperial significance to nomads, as the Orkhon Valley was associated with the capitals of earlier steppe empires and confederations, such as the Uyghur Empire, whose capital of Karabalagun had been built there. Karabalagasun's ruins, or Ordu Balik, are only 30 kilometers north of where Karakorum was built. It's also the home of the famed Orkhon inscriptions of the Turkic Khaganates. For an ever-growing Mongol imperial identity as the masters of the steppes, it was a powerful political connection to lean on. While Chinggis Khan may have designated the site of Karakorum to serve as the great capital of his empire, as we've shown in our previous episodes, he spent the remainder of his life on campaign and preparing for campaign. It's doubtful any construction was undertaken on his orders. While Ogadai may have built on a site chosen by his father, what he built was entirely his own, and served as the administrative center of much of Eurasia for the next 30 years. Karakorum was not a huge city, even by medieval standards. Travelers to the city in the 1250s found a population of around 10,000 people. Separated into 4 quarters and surrounded by a low wall, Karakorum was an amazingly diverse city. Mosques, Christian churches, Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist temples stood across the street from each other. Markets were constructed for merchants traveling from across the Muslim world, while Chinese craftsmen built the imperial palace, and later captured artisans from Europe were brought back to further decorate it, most famously in the form of a silver tree with 4 spouts to pour various alcoholic drinks from. With its own mint for coinage, gold and silversmiths, along with blacksmiths and other craftsmen, it served as a major production center. The major streets were paved with limestone, lined with wood to prevent displacement during the freezing and thawing cycles, and all atop gravel to aid in water drainage. A canal was even dug to bring water into the city and drive the water wheels of the smiths. Many scribes and members of the bureaucracy could be found there, taking in messages sent from across the empire via the Yam system, and passing on instructions back. Numerous storehouses were built to house captured goods and tribute sent by subservient peoples, and it was to Ogedai's delight to showcase his generosity by using this loot to overpay merchants several times what their goods were worth. This served as an effective means to encourage merchants to actually make the journey to Karakoram, which, in contrast to a nomadic camp, featured amenities to keep visitors occupied and entertained. Limited agriculture was undertaken around the city, with evidence for wheat and barley, and one account mentions a proud farmer presenting his locally grown radishes to Ogedai. The city was not self-sufficient, however, and at its height required hundreds of cartloads of food to be shipped to the city daily in order to feed it, something which came to be a major strategic weakness later in the century. The Great Khan essentially used Karakoram as his office, and the city likely had few actual Mongols within it at any given time. Rather than actually residing in Karakoram's palace, Ogedai and his successors continued to nomadize around the capital, venturing within it sparingly as business or ritual commanded. Ogedai himself preferred another palace he had built in Mongolia, the Wenengong, or Palace of Eternal Peace. Having a fixed location to send diplomats and treasure was to the benefit of the empire, while also helping to rebuild the overland trade routes damaged in the initial Mongol expansion. Neither was it the only city in Mongolia at the time, though it was certainly the largest. There was also Qinghai Balasagun, meaning Qinghai's city, named for the able minister Qinghai, a former Ongut merchant who served as Ogedai's chancellor. Built by thousands of captured Chinese, it was intended as a logistics base in western Mongolia to prepare for the great invasion of Khwarezm, but had turned into a major farming and production center, manufacturing goods and weapons for Mongol armies. Ogedai's early reign was marked by activity. New conquests were launched across Eurasia, an extensive new administration was created, and a capital city built. Perhaps initially uncertain of how fit he was for the position, Ogedai was eager to prove himself a worthy successor to his awe-inspiring and terrifying father. The expansion of the Mongol Empire only continued under Ogedai, and his armies seemed unstoppable. Chinggis Khan bequeathed him a mighty army, but Ogedai built a political system to back it up. A number of historians, for this reason, consider him to be the true founder of the Mongol Empire. But the zeal was soon burned out of Ogedai, and by 1237 he essentially removed himself from most affairs of state. With access to most of the alcohol of Eurasia, Ogedai busied himself by sampling as much as he could. His final years were swallowed up by constant drunkenness, and without his forceful presence, corruption set in. His second wife, Torgene Khatun, began exercising her own authority, pushing to the edge reform-minded figures such as Yalo Chusai and Mahmud Yalavach. This later period of Ogedai's rule and his weakness will be investigated in an upcoming episode, but our next episodes will detail the continued conquests by the Mongol armies on Ogedai's orders, beginning with the final destruction of the Jurchen Jin Empire. This will carry us on to the invasion of Europe, so be sure to subscribe to the Ages of Conquest, a Kings and Generals podcast, and to continue helping us bring you more outstanding content, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And if you want to help us continue to grow our audience, be sure to leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one. A desperate, starving crowd of thousands presses together, smothering each other in the narrow city streets. Defenders clad in broken or hastily repaired lamellar armor hurry to and fro, responding to new alerts along the city walls. The constant thundering of stones slamming into the city walls. The loud cracks of bombs exploding, lobbed into houses by the enemy's siege weapons, and setting them alight. Screams, some ongoing and others cutting off suddenly, marking where a poor defender, foolish enough to stick his head over the ramparts, was struck by arrows. Outside the city, smoke billowed up, siege engines set on fire by the defender. Beyond them was the whinnying of tens of thousands of Mongol horses, with Chinese subjects and allies sharpening swords and preparing for the assault. Such was life in the nearly year-long siege of Kaifeng, capital of the Jin Empire, and now the target of the Mongol war machine. Today, we look at the final collapse of the Jurchen-ruled Jin dynasty, ending the 20-year-long Mongol conquest of northern China. Victory here laid the groundwork for Mongol war with the masters of southern China, the Song dynasty, setting the stage for a conflict which would eventually leave the Mongols the rulers of the Middle Kingdom. I'm your host David, and this is the Ages of Conquest, the Mongol Invasions. We've covered the early stages of the Mongol-Jin War in previous episodes, but to give a quick recap, Mongol armies under Chinggis Khan had invaded the Jin Empire in 1211. The Jin, ruled by the Jurchen hailing from Manchuria and ancestors of the later Manchu, controlled China north of the Huai River and had enjoyed a fearsome military reputation, renowned for their heavy cavalry and horse archers. But after nearly a century of their rule, the semi-nomadic Jurchen in China had adopted Chinese culture and language, losing their formidable military edge. Jin armies were routinely swept away in the field by the Mongols, and those Jurchen and Khitans, who still lived as nomads or semi-nomads, were soon allied with Chinggis Khan. In 1215, the Emperor Xuanzong of Jin fled south of the Yellow River, abandoning the capital of Zhongdu, now modern Beijing, and cutting ties to his Manchurian homeland. Formerly hardy horsemen, the final emperors of the Jin dynasty, though still ethnically Jurchen, were now little different from the Chinese. Their armies were now made up of Chinese infantry, having lost most of their access to the horse-producing regions. Defections from the Jin army early on in the war brought the Mongols knowledge of Chinese siege weapons, and soon the fortifications of northern China were reduced one by one. When Chinggis Khan moved against the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219, the Jin were granted no respite, as the talented commander Mukhali was left to continue pressure on the Jin. Only Mukhali's death in 1223 granted the Jin a brief rest, with Mongol attacks for the next few years becoming decidedly more limited. The Jin had been in an unenviable position from 1215 to 1223. Mongol pressure in the north was unrelenting and of great concern, bringing the losses of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. In the west, the Tangut-ruled Xixia, former Jin vassals, had submitted to the Mongols and joined them in attacking the Jin. In the east, the Shandong Peninsula and surrounding coastline was lost to a local insurrection known as the Redcoats, an umbrella term for a collection of independent warlords, some of whom declared for the Mongols, some of whom declared for the Song dynasty, and all hating the Jin. The Chinese Song dynasty ruled almost all of China south of the Huai River, and were a formidable economic power, as well as being longtime foes of the Jin. Having lost their northern territories and two emperors to the Jurchen in the early 1100s, few tears were shed in the Song court for the Jin struggles. In 1217, the Jin invaded the Song, a shocking development considering their ongoing military issues, but one with the intention to essentially provide further room to retreat from the Mongols. Fighting continued until 1221, proving both indecisive and wasteful. 1223 to 1224 provided an unexpected change of events. Beginning with Mukhali's death, we have already noted reduction in Mongol pressure. Though Mukhali's son and brother continued to campaign, it was without Tangut military support, as their forces had abandoned Mukhali in his final days. Furthermore, Chinggis Khan was still absent in Central Asia, though making his return. This was the first real breathing room northern China had experienced in well over a decade. In the first days of 1224, the Emperor Xuanzong of Jin died, succeeded by his third son, Ningjiasu, known also by his chosen Chinese personal name, Wanyan Xiushi, Wanyan being the royal clan of the Jurchen Jin. 25 years old on his ascension, Ningjiasu was the closest the Jin came to a competent monarch since the death of Shizong of Jin in 1189. More even-handed and thoughtful than Xuanzang of Jin, and more competent than the arrogant and inept Wei Xiaowang. Had Ningjiasu taken the throne at any other time, he may have enjoyed a fine reputation. However, he was unable to arrest the collapse of his state and would die only a few hours before the end of his dynasty. In life, rulers of Chinese-style dynasties are simply known as the emperor, and prior to the Ming dynasty, would take era titles to delineate certain years of their reign. After their deaths, they're all given posthumous temple names, such as Taizu for dynastic founders. Xuanzang of Jin was the posthumous title for Ningjiasa's father, whose personal name had been Wudubu. Wudubu's predecessor was so hated, he was posthumously demoted from emperor to prince, and hence known as the Prince of Wei, or Wei Xiaowang. The posthumous temple name given to Ningjiasu was Aizong, meaning pitiable ancestor. His Chinese personal name, Shu Shu, was also turned into a pun by the Mongols, as it sounded similar to little slave. Aizong of Jin, as we'll call him, had a promising start to his reign. Both the Tangut and Song emperors died in a similar time, and Aizong quickly set about organizing peace between them, though no military cooperation came of this. Able to redistribute troops among the Mongols and Redcoats, the Jin also began to receive horses in trade from the Tangut. Seeking to improve relations with the Mongols on Chinggis Khan's death, Aizong even sent envoys bearing formal condolences to the Mongols, though they were turned away. Jin forces were able to reoccupy some territory and strengthen fortifications. As we mentioned earlier, Xuanzang of Jin had moved the capital from Zhongdu to Kaifeng in 1215. Though a foolhardy decision which brought Mongol armies back into China, it wasn't strategically awful. Kaifeng in the central Henan province had been the capital of the Song dynasty before being captured by the Jurchen in the early 12th century. With massive walls, a large population, and rich hinterland, the city itself was difficult to siege. Unlike Zhongdu, which was situated comparatively close to Mongolia, Kaifeng was sheltered behind the Yellow River, fordable only at select and guarded points. Any passage directly over the river could prove highly costly. The Mongols would thus be more inclined to ford the river further along its great bend towards the Ordos, allowing them to make an approach to the west of the city. This would bring them into the mountainous territory in Shanxi province to Hainan's west, the passage between these provinces guarded by the fortress of Tongguan. Bordered by mountains and possessing a strong garrison, either Tongguan would have to be forced by a costly siege or bypassed entirely by cutting south through the territory of the now neutral Song dynasty. Indeed, this was advice Chinggis Khan was said to have given his sons on his deathbed. But since peace had now been reached between Jin and Song, it was impossible to say if they would allow Mongol troops through their country unimpeded. Such was the problem Ogedai faced when he became Khan in 1229. Ogedai was not the military equal of his father or brothers, and to quiet questions of how fit he was to succeed his famous father, he needed to complete the conquest of the Jin. Growing bolder through the recapture of their cities, defeats of small Mongol parties, and absence of any major offensives for some years, the Jin would be a test of worthiness for the new Khan. Weeks after becoming Khan, Ogedai sent an army against the Jin, perhaps just to test the waters. A Mongol army of 8,000 under Dohulhu entered Shanxi at the end of 1229, besieging Qingyangfu. After a failed Jin peace embassy, a relief force was raised under the commander Pu'a, with a vanguard of the loyal and filial army. Pu'a was a bit of a rapscallion who had led raids into Mongol-occupied territory for several years, looting and carrying off captured horses and provisions, then withdrawing before Mongol forces could catch him. Though his habit of playing up minor skirmishes like they were great victories, he had earned a reputation for skill against the Mongols, though whether it was deserved was another matter. The loyal and filial army, which Puah had been associated with for years, also had an unsavory though effective reputation. Made up of deserters and captives from the Mongols, it included northern Chinese, Uyghurs, Naiman, Tanguts, and the odd Kipchak. These were mounted units specializing in Mongol tactics. Paid 3 times that of a normal soldier to encourage defections from the diverse Mongol armies, by the 1230s this was a crack force of 7,000. Often undisciplined and unruly, they proved effective at plundering and were fine horse archers. One of Puah's commanders, Cheng He Shang, commanded a 1,000-strong vanguard of these men. At Dachangyuan in January and February of 1230, Puah drew Dolhuhu's force up for battle. Cheng He Shang led the loyal and filial army as vanguard, and for the first time in nearly 20 years of war, the Jin defeated the Mongols in open battle. After the battle, Puah released a captured Mongol envoy and sent him to Ogadai with a simple message. "We've got all our soldiers and horses ready. Come on over and fight." Soon afterwards, Puah, Cheng He Shang, and the general Hada defeated a Mongol army investing Weizhou on the northern bank of the Yellow River in Henan. Ogadai was furious and frightened. Dolhuhu was removed from command and possibly poisoned. Puah's boast, followed by actual Jin victories, coupled with peace famine-stricken Shanxi, or relocated to the barren Qinling Mountains during the summer of 1231. Lacking resources to feed perhaps 20 to 30,000 men, medieval authors speak of cannibalism occurring here. They could hardly eat the horses they needed for war, after all. These starving men faced a difficult ride through hostile territory, beyond which they needed to return to the Jin realm with strength and numbers to fight. It's a testament to Tului's military ability that he kept his men together through this hard ride through mountainous territory. Once they reached the Song border in November 1231, Tului allowed his men a month of pillaging across Sichuan. This Song province was rich, fertile, and untouched by the 2 decades of Mongol-Jin warfare, a chance for Tului's men to regain strength, morale, and fatten their horses. It also showcased a noted weakness of the Song border defenses. Tului's troops traveled over 290 kilometers into Song territory before turning back. This was not the first occasion of Song-Mongol warfare. A brief clash had occurred in 1227 during the destruction of the Tangut Kingdom, when Mongol forces attacking the western edge of the Jin Empire had gone over the border and raided Song prefectures. The chief counselor of the Song dynasty, Shi Mi Yuan, in power since 1208, was as cautious and pragmatic as he was unpopular in the empire, and he was very unpopular. Neither clash was enough for him to send Song Chinese to die at Mongol hands, and he didn't let Tului's raid escalate into a full military response. Tului was thus able to enter the southern flank of Jin-ruled Henan province in January 1232. The Jin were panicking now, and Puah and Hada rapidly withdrew the garrisons of Tongguan to catch Tului. At Sanfeng Mountain, Tului and Subutai found themselves surrounded by multiple converging Jin forces under Puah and Hada. Puah sent a message to Tului which, in the words of the Ilkhanid Vizier Rashid al-Din, the Jin threatened to do this and that to their womenfolk. The actual message was certainly not so polite, and Tului bristled at this. Surrounded, the Mongols were in a tough position. Aid came from an unexpected direction, as it suddenly began to snow forcefully, a blizzard mixed with hail. Subadai reminded Tului that they were facing soft men from cities and small villages. The Mongols, used to harsh winters on the open steppe, put on their winter coats and waited on their horses. The Jin troops were unprepared for the early February storm, and for 4 days they froze and suffered. On the 4th day, deciding their enemy was suitably weakened, Tului ordered the assault. Racing down the mountainside, the Mongols cut into the Jin and obliterated them, Puah and Hada both captured. As punishment for their threat to rape the Mongol women, we are told the Mongols sodomized the captured Jin troops and made a huge mound of severed ears from the slain. The defeat at Sanfang Mountain and capture of their best generals marked the end of the Jin dynasty's offensive capabilities. Ogadai pushed through the northern defenses and was soon reunited with his brother. Subadai was given overall command of the army while Ogadai and Tului returned to Mongolia, possibly because Ogadai had fallen quite ill. In April 1232, Subadai began the siege of Kaifeng, a noose which took almost a year to tighten. Ogadai and Tului returned to Mongolia. Precisely what occurred is unclear, but by the end of 1232, Tului was dead. The official version in the secret history of the Mongols had Ogadai fall deathly ill, and Tului urges the spirits to take him instead, sacrificing himself for his brother. But mention of him drinking a special brew prepared for him have fueled rumors that Ogadai in fact had his brother poisoned. The problem with this theory is that it relies too strongly on later antagonism between the heirs of Ogadai and Tului. By all accounts, the two brothers were extremely close, and later editing to what became the secret history of the Mongols by Tului's sons may have chosen to portray their father more heroically, and by villainizing Ogadai, helped justify their eventual ascension to the throne. Other writers like Giovanni say Tului drank himself to death. Since this was the fate Ogadai and numerous other Mongolian princes shared, this is actually rather likely. Ogadai Khan lost his closest companion late in 1232, a loss from which he never recovered. Back at Kaifeng, Subadai led a brutal siege. The city, so flooded with refugees that it held over 1 million people, was totally blockaded, starvation and pandemic setting in over the summer of 1232. Gunpowder weapons were used by both sides in the form of bombs lobbed by catapults and in fire lances by the Jin. Essentially a flamethrower, fire lances shot a jet of fire 3 meters long, burning men to death horrifically, and were used to effectively block breaches in walls. You can see them in action in episode 10, season 1 of Netflix's Marco Polo. Subadai tried various means to breach the walls of Kaifeng, but the city was skillfully defended. Sappers would approach the wall under mobile shelters with the intention to physically dig through them. Jin defenders dropped bombs onto them, destroying both shelters and attackers. Dikes on the Yellow River were broken, flooding the plain and the city. This resistance was valiant but ultimately doomed. The Jin leadership was chaotic, with individuals promoted, then demoted and executed within days for perceived slights or on suspicion of treachery. Finally, in February 1233, Aizong of Jin abandoned the city with some loyal guards, leaving it to its fate. One commander left in Kaifeng, Tsui Li, assassinated those still loyal to Aizong, leaving himself in control. Realizing the only way to spare the population was a voluntary surrender, on 29th of May 1233, Tsui Li opened the gates to Subadai. Ogadai was urged to mercy by the protests of his advisor, Yellow Chutsai, and Subadai was restricted to plundering, killing only 500 members of the royal Wanyan clan, who were still in the city. Tsui Li, for his efforts, was assassinated by another Jin officer in response for an offense Tsui Li had committed to the man's wife. By August 1233, Aizong of Jin and his ever-decreasing retinue fled to Caizhou, only 64 kilometers from the Song border. Aizong's messages to the Song for aid, warning them that they would be the next targets of the Mongols, fell on deaf ears. The Song agreed to cooperate with the Mongols against the Jin, closing off Aizong's route of escape. By November 1233, a Song army joined Subadai outside Caizhou. Caizhou was reduced to starvation, but its defenders fought tooth and nail, inflicting heavy casualties. But there could be no other end. As Mongol Song forces filled in a lake nearby with bundles of reeds and sticks to gain access to the city in February 1234, Aizong declared he would not be remembered as the last Jin emperor. He abdicated for a distant relation, a man in better shape who Aizong faintly hoped would escape and continue to resist. Barely had Aizong hanged himself and the new emperor been enthroned when the Mongols had broken through the walls. On the 9th of February 1234, the final emperor of the Jin dynasty died fighting in the streets alongside his men, having reigned only a few hours. So ended the Jurchen Jin dynasty, controlling North China for a little over a century. Despite defections, defeats, and numerous other setbacks, both Jurchen and Chinese alike showed loyalty to the dynasty to the very end. Few other kingdoms had suffered the full might of the Mongols as the Jin had, and it was not an easy conquest. In 400 years, the descendants of the Jurchen, the Manchu, would come to rule both the Mongols and the Chinese, but that's quite another story. The Mongol-Song alliance barely outlasted the Jin. Subadai moved north with his armies not long afterwards, eager for discussions on where to take them next. The Song commander in the region, Mengung, withdrew as well, the devastated Henan province no place to keep an army fed. Aside from a few sites, most of the area, including Kaifeng, stayed in Mongol hands. As we've noted earlier, Kaifeng had once been a capital of the Song dynasty before it fell to the Jurchen. Long had voices in the Song clamored to reclaim the north. Chief Counselor Shi Mi-yuan had kept these hawks in check during his long administration, but his death in late 1233 left a vacuum, one the feeble Emperor Lizong of Song could not fill. These Song officials and commanders who had first-hand experience of conditions in the north and against the Mongols knew what a foolhardy thought a campaign there would be, and understood the limits of the Song army, an army which had never performed well offensively against either the Khitan Liao or Jurchen Jin. However, Song generals